Throughout history, there have been many different torture methods used to punish and extract information out of a prisoner. One of the most ruthless methods, the rack, even led to a number of deaths as someone was stretched to within an inch of their life. Torture in England throughout the years was not administered as much as most people believe, but during times of conflict it became a ruthless practice which became of incredible importance. Different nations used different methods, but they all had the same intention. Over the past few years we've looked at many different torture methods, but which was the most brutal? Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
It was during the reign of the Tudor monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I that the rack is most closely associated with, but it did have a longer history, which dates back to the ancient times. It's believed that the Greeks may have even used the rack first as a way of torturing slaves around 300 years BC, and the whole point of the device was to extract information. Herostratus, a man who was later executed for burning down the Temple of Artemis, was placed on the rack to find out more information about the burning of one of the wonders of the ancient world. Then during the Roman times, it was used by Emperor Nero. He faced an assassination attempt, and to extract more information from the conspirators, the rack was used, and it was even used on a woman. This helped to solidify Nero's brutal reputation as a feared leader. In Britain, the rack first emerged before the Tudor period, around the mid-1400s, and the Constable of the Tower of London at the time, John Holland, brought the device to the fortress. The rack became known as the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, as Holland was the second Duke of Exeter. It was during this time that the rack became infamously used, and used to extract information during interrogations. As a device, the rack had a number of different versions created in different countries. In Europe it was used in the form of a ladder, where someone would be strung up to and stretched, but it usually had a wooden frame that was raised off the ground and was flat. A prisoner would then be placed on it, and at each end of the rack was a roller and rope and chains, where someone's wrists and ankles would be attached to. During the racking, the interrogators would ask a number of questions, starting off slowly, and then turning the rollers, which would cause tension and stretching on the prisoner's limbs. If the prisoner continued to refuse to answer questions and not hand over any information, the interrogators would then turn slowly the ratchet, and the stretching would continue. As the chains cranked and the victim was stretched more, the strain placed on the joints would be excruciating. The shoulders, elbows, knees and hips were placed under intense stress, and at times the joints would dislocate and separate out of their sockets, which was very painful. As medical care was poor during the Tudor times also, this could cause permanent disfigurement. The muscles would be stretched so much that the arms and legs may be so badly damaged that a person may never walk again, and there would be screaming heard throughout the Tower of London. The body would pop also, and cartilage and ligaments would snap, as would bones, as more pressure was exerted on the limbs. If a prisoner continued to refuse, they were continuously racked until they lost consciousness, or if the guards believed they had enough information, they would then stop, but the damage would already have been done. The rack was used alongside other torture methods too, for example the Scavenger's Daughter. This was a device made by another constable of the tower, and was an A-frame which someone's head, arms and legs would be attached to. This would then swing, and the prisoner's body would contort and compress in bizarre and painful ways. When used alongside the rack, which was used to stretch, the compression device of the Scavenger's Daughter would have been horrifically painful. Also, interrogators and guards whilst a prisoner was on the rack would perform other tortures such as pulling out toenails and fingernails, and also they would cut someone's body or even burn them with brands to get them to give over information. There was one shocking account of a woman during the Tudor period being racked for information. Anne Askew was a Protestant who was later burned at the stake for heresy. She was linked to a plot with Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, who herself was accused of being too religiously radical. To get Anne Askew to give over information about the Queen, she was brutalised on the rack and was punished so severely that she could not walk to her execution, where she was burned at the stake. She had to be carried on a chair and then was burned on this because her hips and shoulders had also dislocated, and the rack completely ruined Anne Askew and caused her great pain. To make things worse, when she fainted, she was revived a number of times to resume her torture, causing even more suffering. The constable of the tower himself had refused to torture her, as he believed it was wrong to subject a woman to such an ordeal, and whilst he left to speak to the king about it, Anne was tortured. Another account of torture on the rack was that of St. Nicholas Owen, who was a Catholic martyr brutally punished on it. He refused to give over any information about Catholic plots, and was racked so brutally that he actually died on the device, as he was tortured so severely. But the most famous person to be tortured on the rack was Guy Fawkes. He was caught under the Houses of Parliament along with a huge amount of gunpowder, and he planned to blow the king, James I to Kingdom Come, along with his government in the gunpowder plot. Fawkes was the one caught, and it was considered that he was part of a group, and to get him to give over the names he was placed on the rack. He was tortured so badly that he eventually did give over names, and his signature was completely undecipherable when compared to it when he entered the tower. Even the strongest of people would be broken by the rack, and it was a torture method which inflicted such pain and suffering. It helped the Tower of London to gain its notorious and barbaric reputation, and has gone down in history as the most famous torture method used. Often just the sight of the rack was enough for someone to give over information to the guards.
The Scavenger's Daughter as a torture device was used, first during the reign of the notorious King Henry VIII. It was used at the Tower of London and was invented by the Lieutenant of the Tower, a man named Sir Leonard Skeffington. At the Tower he was the man who was in charge of keeping high-profile prisoners under lock and key, and his job was responsible for the welfare of some of the most notorious people ever held at the Tower. Skeffington looked after people such as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and even the future Queen Elizabeth I. It was his job also to administer torture during the reign of Henry VIII, and if the king wished for it, he would then carry out these requests. But Skeffington would then create his own torture device, the Scavenger's Daughter, named after him. This device would press and compress the body of a prisoner and a victim in a painful way, and the body would be forced into the frame in a way that would cause a huge amount of pain. It was made to work with the rack, and the mangled body of a prisoner would be forced into the device, which would then cause more severe agony. There were two different types of the Scavenger's Daughter, the first being a pin-style device, which would hold a prisoner inside the metal frame, and the prisoner was then forced to kneel in the pin, which was then tightened, and this would put a lot of pressure on the prisoner's back. This could easily break someone's back, and the other style of device was more of a frame which was shaped like the letter A. With this, the prisoner's head would be strapped to the top of the A-frame, and then their hands were secured to the middle of the device, through some holes at the side. The legs would be then secured to the bottom of the frame, and then the device would fold and swing, which would force the head down and the legs and knees would be forced up, into a sitting position. This was a huge stress placed on the prisoner's muscles, and if they had been placed on the rack, it would cause even more pain and suffering. The victim's head could also then be placed and pushed into a different direction, causing even more strain. But it isn't known that the Scavenger's Daughter was used a huge amount throughout the centuries. It was very easy for a blacksmith to make this device, and Leonard Skeffington is credited with creating it. In one instance, it was said at the Tower that Thomas Meyer was subjected to being put on the device, and he was accused of being involved in linking up with the Irish rebels during the reign of Henry VIII across the sea. He was linked to rebellions, and he denied this, but he was then strapped to the Scavenger's Daughter in order to extract information from him. He would document his horrific torture ordeal on the wall of his cell inside of the Beauchamp Tower, where he was held, and he carved, "By torture strain my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied," and he then signed off with his name. But another man who was tortured on the rack, but also the Scavenger's Daughter, was Thomas Cottam. He was an English priest who was a Catholic, and during the reign of Elizabeth I he would be executed. Elizabeth in her lands would try to solve problems with religion, and would issue her religious settlement, but Catholics continued to be persecuted throughout the land. Cottam was placed on the rack to get information from him about underground worship, but he was then placed on the Scavenger's Daughter to get more from him. It's possible he was put in the device, as he did not give over much information on the rack. Another priest named Luke Kirby during Elizabeth's reign was also placed on the Scavenger's Daughter. The Scavenger's Daughter was a device which was notorious and brutal, and it compressed the body in such a way that blood would be forced from the nose and ears of the prisoner. It was seen as the perfect complement to the rack, as it would compress rather than stretch, and would be horrific in its punishment. The Japanese would, throughout the war, inflict different torture methods onto prisoners. This varied from having fingernails ripped from their hands to electric shocks, and even at times brutal floggings, which would cause death. The torturers were there to extract information, and one former Japanese officer stated of this that the major means of getting intelligence was to extract information by interrogating prisoners. Torture was an unavoidable necessity. Murdering and burying them follows naturally. You do it so you won't be found out. I believed and acted this way because I was convinced of what I was doing. We carried out our duty as instructed by our masters. We did it for the sake of our country. From our obligation to our ancestors. On the battlefield, we never really considered the Chinese humans. When you're winning, the losers look really miserable. They also waterboarded prisoners, but one of the most striking and horrific torture methods used was known as bamboo torture. A victim would be secured and tied down over a number of bamboo shoots, which would then grow very quickly. Bamboo as a plant can grow extremely quickly, and when it grows the stems and shoots are very sharp, and the aim of this torture was for the victim to hand over information before the bamboo then grew and then impaled the victim. This was done often with the prisoner being strapped down, and at first it would be very uncomfortable, but then the sharp shoot, jabbing itself into a victim's body, could be enough for them to decide to give over information. The whole point of this was to extract intelligence, but also to spread torture and horror. It was claimed that tales were told by surviving prisoners and soldiers who found the mutilated bodies of their lost comrades, how the Japanese placed bamboo shoots under the tied down Allied soldiers. The bamboo shoots are rapidly growing, even so it might take a few days for a prisoner to finally die from the sharpened bamboo tips that pierce their body bit by painful, slowly bit. The bamboo at times would grow right through the torso, it's believed, and it could rise to a height of around 10 feet, but this would of course also be an execution method. An episode of the popular TV show Mythbusters even looked at this, and what they found was that bamboo was capable of entering a human body and penetrating it over the course of just 3 days. Soldiers did report finding the mutilated corpses of Allied soldiers, which were said to have been subjected to this torture and treatment, but there is little documentary evidence out there specifically relating to bamboo torture. But from what we know about the brutality of some Japanese soldiers during World War II, then it's more than likely that they could have done this and subjected many prisoners to this torture and treatment. The definition of waterboarding in a secret American CIA memorandum states that, in this procedure the individual is bound securely to an inclined bench, which is approximately 4 feet by 7 feet. The individual's feet are generally elevated. A cloth is placed over the forehead and eyes. Water is then applied to the cloth in a controlled manner. As this is done, the cloth is lowered until it covers both the nose and mouth. Once the cloth is saturated and completely covers the mouth and nose, airflow is slightly restricted for 20 to 40 seconds due to the presence of the cloth. During those 20 to 40 seconds, water is continuously applied from a height of 12 to 24 inches. After this period, the cloth is lifted and the individual is allowed to breathe unimpeded for 3 or 4 small breaths. The procedure may be then repeated. The water is usually applied from a canteen cup or a small watering can with a spout. You have informed us that it is likely that this procedure would not last more than 20 minutes in any one application. Because of how horrific it is often considered a very controversial torture method, and those who have experienced it last a matter of seconds because it simulates drowning and the desperation and panic then kicks in. It has a brutal mental effect and can still traumatise victims years later, and some were so badly affected they could not take showers, and some even began to get stressed when it rained. One man who experienced the treatment for an experiment claimed, "You may have read by now the official lie about this treatment, which is that it simulates a feeling of drowning. This is not the case. You feel that you are drowning because you are drowning, or rather being drowned, albeit slowly and under controlled conditions and at the mercy of those who are applying the pressure." Often a victim is laid on a board when this treatment happens, and it became illegal under the laws of war with the Third Geneva Convention of 1929, which required that prisoners of war should be treated humanely. But as mentioned, this is not a new torture method, and it was used throughout history to a large extent. One man who suffered this in the 16th century stated, "Master Hans took water. During the entire time a cloth had been laid on my face, and holding my nose shut with one hand, began to pour water on my abdomen, and then all over my breast, and into my mouth, even as one should drink when he is very thirsty. I think that the can from which he poured out the water held about 3 pints, and when I was at the end of my breath, and wanted to fetch such, I drew the water all into my body, whereupon I suffered such distress that it would be impossible for me to relate or describe it. But the Lord be forever praised, he kept my lips, and when they could still not obtain anything from me, they caused the cord which was on my thigh to be loosened, and applied to a fresh place, and wound it much tighter than before, so that I thought it would kill me, and began to shake and tremble greatly. He then proceeded to pour water into me again, so that I think he emptied 4 such cans, and my body became so full that it twice came out again at the throat." Another man who was subjected to waterboarding claimed, "Water flowed everywhere, in my mouth, in my nose, all over my face. But for a while I could still breathe in some small gulps of air. I tried by contracting my throat to take in as little water as possible, and to resist suffocation by keeping air in my lungs for as long as I could. But I couldn't hold on for more than a few moments. I had the impression of drowning, and a terrible agony, that of death itself took possession of me. In spite of myself, all the muscles of my body struggled uselessly to save me from suffocation. In spite of myself, the fingers of both my hands shook uncontrollably." Following the September 11th attacks, the George Bush administration in America stated in secret documents that they believed that waterboarding was not torture. Because of this, it was used against captured members of Al-Qaeda who were linked to the attacks. This information got out and caused a significant degree of controversy, and many claimed that waterboarding was illegal under international law, and a victim would say practically anything to make the ordeal stop. But it has to be one of the most barbaric torture methods in history, and it can cause damage to the lungs, as well as other severe injuries, such as brain damage caused from the deprivation of oxygen. Little Ease was an oubliette-style dungeon found inside specifically the White Tower, inside the oldest central part of the Tower of London. This specific castle keep was built during the Norman conquest, following William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings. But Little Ease was a tiny dungeon in which a prisoner was locked and shut inside of the cell. Because it was so small, someone could not stand or sit, and the prisoner was forced to crouch for a significant amount of time, for even weeks on end. The prisoners subjected to this were often tortured in other ways inside of the tower, using harrowing devices such as a rack and a stretching device that was very dangerous. Also, the prisoners would then be manacled or subjected to the Scavengers Daughter before they went into Little Ease. Specifically, Little Ease was a windowless cell which measured just around 4 square feet, and it was very cramped. It was a small dark space where hardly any air would get in or light, and the prisoner could hear the torture of others in other dungeons of the White Tower. It was psychological torture being locked in the dark for long periods of time, and the prisoner had to contend with their injuries also. Torture was not as often used throughout the Tudor period as many believe, and there were only a handful amounts of time that it was in the tower used. It was a desperate situation, as information needed to be extracted, and that's why torture was allowed to happen. Little Ease was considered the most serious of torture methods, and it could be seen as a last resort, and the prisoners who would not be broken were locked inside the oubliette dungeon. During the reign of King Henry VIII, 2 prisoners, one a woman, was accused of stealing a huge amount of gold and money from the king. Alice Tankerville, the woman, was said to have seduced a guard of the Tower of London, who was meant to keep her locked up, and together the guard and prisoner planned an escape attempt. They also managed to get out of the Tower of London. They made their way past the gatehouse, but they were then captured by the Night's Watch. Alice Tankerville, alongside her husband, was hanged at the low water mark in the River Thames, and over hours she had to contend with her impending execution and death. However, John Board, the guard, was seen as bringing shame upon the royal bodyguard, and he was tortured brutally. He was placed on the rack and was beaten very badly, but also he was thrown inside of Little Ease for his treatment, before he was hanged in chains, a broken man, from the walls of the Tower of London. There are a few other examples of prisoners being locked inside of Little Ease, and one record claims, On the 3rd of May 1555, Stephen Happs, for his lewd behaviour and obstinacy, committed this day to the Tower to remain in Little Ease for 2 or 3 days till he may be further examined. Another example occurred during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, as it was said, on the 10th of January 1591, Richard Topcliffe is set to take part in an examination in the Tower of George Beasley, seminary priest, and Robert Humberson, his companion, and if you shall see good cause by their obstinate refusal to declare the truth of such things as shall be laid to their charge in Her Majesty's behalf, then shall you by authority hereof commit them to the prison called Little Ease, or to such other ordinary place of punishment as hath been accustomed to be used in these cases, and to certify proceedings from time to time. However, following the end of the Tudor period and the accession of James I onto the throne, there was a lot of animosity towards the new Scottish king, who united the thrones of England and Scotland. Famously, the Gunpowder Plot was planned, and the most famous plotter of them all, Guy Fawkes, was during his torture ordeal sent to Little Ease. He was racked brutally before, and was then thrown inside of Little Ease, and the combination of the rack and the oubliette-style dungeon was enough to get Fawkes to confess his crimes. But after this, Little Ease was not used much more, as torture was also not really deployed. With regards to where it actually was, it may have been possibly in the White Tower, but also it may have been found inside the Flint Tower rather than the White Tower, or it may have just been a hole in a wall in some part of the tower which was covered up by a wooden hatch. But Little Ease was one of the most brutal torture dungeons in history. The head crusher was a device which was aimed to increase pressure on the head and the skull, and it was used alongside other torture devices, but it was considered one of the more serious devices in a torturer's arsenal. The metal device utilised a plate which was placed below the jaw of the victim, and this was connected to a head cap. On the head cap was a screw, which when the torturer twisted this handle, the gap between the head cap and the plate grew less. This resulted in the pressure being cranked up on the skull of the victim, and this caused immense pain. Certain areas such as the mandible, facial bones and also the teeth of the victim would be subjected to immense pressure and strain. This was incredibly painful and could break the bones and cause more terrifying mutilation. Some of these devices even contained a basket of some form to catch the eyes of the victim if they popped out of the head. Sometimes a torturer would stop the ordeal before a victim died, or before so much strain was put on the head that disfigurement took place to the victim's face. But they then tried to extract information from the person, but when they continued, often the victim's head would be crushed over a period of time, each turn of the handle exerting even more pressure until the victim died. The effect of this was an immensely painful death, as the jaw of the victim was crushed, and to make things worse, the torturer could even smash the top of the metal cap with a hammer, which would cause even more pain, and the vibrations from this could also cause more pain. The head crusher, as a medieval torture device today, looks incredibly harrowing and terrifying, and it is something that was used in different lands to extract confessions from a victim. Often if the torture did stop halfway through, as someone gave over information, then the victim would be left with irreparable damage to the brain, jaw or eyes. The head was slowly compressed and the teeth would be shattered, with the victim dying a very painful death. The head crusher was used during the Spanish Inquisition, and it was something that had a terrifying legacy, and must be considered one of the most barbaric torture methods used throughout history. During the medieval period, there was a practice known as trial by ordeal. This was where guilt or innocence of someone accused of a crime was determined by subjecting them to a painful and often dangerous ordeal or experience. Trial by ordeal had many different elements to it. For example, one type was using fire, in which the accused often had to hold a red-hot iron. Their injuries would then be bandaged up, and if the wounds had healed over time, they were said to have been either guilty or innocent. Usually they were sentenced to death if the wounds were festering and had not healed, as this was seen as God ignoring their injuries, as they were clearly guilty, and God was not saving them. Other trials by ordeal included water, in which victims were thrown into water, and this was often used to imply guilt or innocence, during witch trials, as many women were ducked in water on a stool. But the alfet was a method of torture that was used for trial by ordeal, and this was a large cauldron which was filled with boiling water, or other boiling hot liquid. The arm of the person who was accused, once the water was boiling, was then forced into the water for a significant number of seconds up until their elbow. This must have been excruciatingly painful, with the burns being terrible. What happened next was that the arm and hand, which had been subjected to the fire vat, or the alfet, were then bound with bandages, and they were then left for 3 days. After this time had passed, a priest or a judge would inspect the wound, and he would then take off the bandages. If the wound was said to have begun to heal cleanly, without any signs of infection, then this would have said to have been an indication that someone was innocent, as God had stepped in to save their soul, then help them in their hour of need. If the wound was unhealed or worse, infected, then the victim was deemed to have been guilty, as God was ignoring them, and he knew they were guilty. Shockingly, also the fire vat, or the alfet, was also used for religious devotion and for cleansing the body of sin, as someone would climb into the cauldron with boiling water, and then this would allegedly then free the person from sin or their guilt. Boiling oil was also used for trial by ordeal. This was used in parts of Africa, as someone was ordered to retrieve an item from a cauldron of boiling oil, and those who refused to do this would be deemed guilty. All of this was incredibly dangerous and could easily kill someone. The alfet could result in death due to the immense pain from the burn, or from the shock that was caused by the treatment. Interestingly, legal texts from the reign of King Athelstan of the Saxons showed the royal regulations for the use of trial by ordeal, and included in this is the instruction that the water must be close to boiling temperature, that the water must come up to the elbow when it was submerged in. Sometimes these ordeals even took place inside of a church. The alfet today is considered a forgotten torture device and method which was referred to as a fire vat for a reason. It could result in death due to the immense pain. It often resulted in someone being put to death anyway, as their wounds were so severe that they would struggle to heal in time. Rat torture was where guards of a prison or a castle would use rats and mice to cause pain and suffering onto a prisoner who had no chance of escape, and the animals were encouraged to maim and eat the skin of the unfortunate soul who was experiencing this. It was used inside of many different towns and cities throughout history, and of course many people associate rats with disease, and they were the carriers of the Black Death, as the fleas that caused the deadly pestilence during the medieval period were on the back of the rats. But there were specific parts of the Tower of London, a fortress synonymous with torture, where guards inside the facility would get rats to then use for torture later. Specifically inside of the Tower of London there was a place near to the River Thames, presumably in one of the outer towers, known as Rat's Dungeon, or the Dungeon of the Rats, and inside of this damp and dark room close to the river, the rats were encouraged in from the River Thames. It was claimed in this that a cell below high water mark and totally dark was used to entice the rats from the Thames to come in. The guards had a constant supply of these animals to then use in torture, and it was claimed that prisoners were to have been alarm excited when tortured using rats in the tower, and that they had flesh torn from their arms and legs, as the rats bit and maimed them. There were rats used to inflict suffering and pain onto prisoners at the tower during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the younger daughter of King Henry VIII. It was a time where torture was usually administered by the Queen herself, meaning that Elizabeth I encouraged this and signed off on it. There were specifically Catholic priests and writers who were subjected to rat torture, and these would have been forced to experience this as the torturers wanted information about other banned Catholic priests and worship. Rat torture was deployed in many different countries, and not just in England though. It was used more recently than you would imagine, as during the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile it was deployed, and also has been used recently inside other South American nations such as Argentina and Brazil. One man during the Dutch Revolt had a pottery bowl which was placed upside down on his stomach, and then rats were introduced. He was tortured, and then the bowl was heated up, and the rats were inside of this, and they became so panicked that they began to eat the stomach of the prisoner and to try and burrow out through his human body. Rats were often associated with disease and dirtiness, and this was a torture method which must be considered one of the worst in history. To have rats trying to eat someone's body, and they would have been only removed if the guard felt satisfied by the answers given, must have been harrowing and brutal. Also, one thing to consider is the injuries sustained throughout this torture ordeal could easily become infected, which would also lead to death, as there was little to no knowledge about infection and how to treat this. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.